Hello, my name is Xander. Welcome to the Python Beginners course. This is the last module in this beginners course where we're going to have a look and learn about functions. So although this is the last module in this course, it is just the beginning of your journey with Python, and I will be running a new course called Python Beginners Plus, which we can cover more content and just build upon our knowledge that we've learned from this course. In addition to that, in the Python Beginners Plus course, I'll include some more examples, and there'll be slightly bigger examples and challenges, as well as look at other aspects of programming with Python, because we can utilize Python for all types of programming, whether it be web programming, back-end type of programming, or whether it be desktop graphical user interface programming, or potentially mobile phone or machine learning. And there's lots of different applications of Python. So in the Python Beginners Plus course, we explore some of those different types of programming areas that you might want to use Python for. But of course, it doesn't end there. We will move further into Python Intermediate, where we will look at much deeper concepts of Python programming. So let's start by just summarizing in a really simplistic way, what is a function? So a function is a block of code. It allows us to run it when we call it. So we build this block of code, which we call a function, and it performs a certain action that we need. So we basically call it within our program. It performs that action. It can return something, for example, and then we can then potentially use that block of code whenever we need it. So the idea is that if we have any code in our program that we need to run multiple times, we might want to build a function so that we don't have to repeat the code somewhere in our program at any point. So let's start off by creating a function. So we have this keyword here called def. Okay, so that's going to create a function. So this is a keyword we utilize. Then we have the function name. So let's go for print username, for example. Yep. So this name of the function is going to have parentheses at the end here. Okay, so basically we've defined now a function. So let's just say that this here is just telling Python that we're now going to create a new function. This is the function name, and we have the parentheses at the end, which we explain why that is and what that's for. So now we have a function. Great. So that's how to create or define a new function. So let's go on and add something inside of here. For example, username equals, and let's just take, for example, an input. There we go. Okay, so now we have a function. Of course, we're going to need to, like I suggested, we need to call it. We need to tell it we want to run it. We need to tell Python we want to run it. So if we do want to run this function, then we just need to type in the name of the function, and then we can use the parentheses here. And there we go. So now what we've done is we've called this function. So it's going to run this code right here. So now when we run this code, you can see what's happening is that we're now running the code inside of the function. We've requested this function to run its code, its block of code, and it's doing exactly that. So I can type in something here, and there we go. So obviously there's nothing happening here other than we're just typing in the name. So let's expand this idea. So let's create a function here called main. So let's create a new function here called main. This is our main entry point, say, into the application. Right, so this is going to, first of all, it's going to run the code in the print username. Okay, so I'm going to say, oh, of course, return username. Okay, so I've called that return username. Right, so this, first of all, just follow this code. When we run the program, it's going to, first of all, run this function here called main. It's going to run this piece of code, which is going to call and run this function. Okay, so it's running this function here. So it's now going to ask the user to type in their name. Now, what I want to do is I want to capture that information, which I am in this variable, but I want to return it back to my main function here. So I've got this keyword here, or this ability to do that. So utilizing return. So what do I want to return? Well, I want to return whatever's stored in this variable from the input. So let's do that, username. Okay, so what I'm doing here is I'm returning this data here. So I need to store that somewhere. So although I'm calling this function, let's store whatever is returned from this function into a variable here. So I'm just going to call that x. So I'm going to run this function. It's going to return the username that the user types in, and then I'm going to store that into x here. Right, so because I've got that now, I can go ahead and just print. Let's just print x, and there we go. So let's give this a go. Let's run this. So when we run this code, it's going to ask us, well, let's just follow this. So we start the code. It's going to come down to this function here, and it's then going to initiate this function, which is going to run this function here called return username. Right, so we then run the input, and that's what we see in here. So I just type in a name, and that name is going to be stored in this variable here. Now this function is still running, remember, so it then returns the username data. Okay, so back down here, when we call this function here, it's going to return username, and we're going to store that into x, and then we're just going to print x. So there we go. So we just printed the name. So this might take a little bit of practicing in order to get your head around what's happening here. And this is a small scale of a much larger picture that you'll be developing. And hopefully you can start to see that this function here can be called by any program now. So I could build, extend this program, and any time I need the username to enter their name and capture it, I can use this function here. And this function is just designed to get the username and return the username. So let's build upon this idea of functions, and let's just scale this back a bit, right? So let's just call this now name. Okay, so we're going to print, let's go ahead and just print the name. Okay, let's use f, your name is, and then it's going to be, we're going to take a name here, right? So what we can do with a function is not only can we call the function, but we can also pass data to the function. That could be important because this function here might be calculating a bill, for example. So it needs that data in order to actually calculate something. So what we have here is parameters and attributes, or sorry, parameters and arguments. So in this function here, in the parentheses here, I can define parameters. So these are expected data, or this is expected attributes that should be passed over to the function. So let's just take this out. So let's call name. Remember, this is how to run name. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pass an attribute over to the variable. So let's just pass this data, which is a string, of course, over to this function here. So I've called name, that's the function, and I've in here, in the parentheses here, I passed over this attribute called Xander. So I want to capture that now. So at the moment, it's not going to do that because I've not defined here any parameters. So let's go ahead and do that. So this can be anything. I'm going to call this name. Okay, so essentially what's happening here is that this, if we just think about this in a variable type of situation, we know that, for example, name equals Xander, right? So we've got the variable here called name, and that's referencing a string that's stored in memory, Xander. So what we're doing here essentially, you could look at it this way to begin with at least, is that we're going to pass this data over to this function here. And what we're doing here is we've created this point, this reference point called name, and we're placing Xander, say, into this variable. So if let's look at this, we'll create this variable called name, and we put Xander into it. We've assigned Xander to name. And you can see what's happening now in my line 4 here is I'm printing that out. So what's happening here is I'm passing this data over to the function called name, and I'm referencing Xander via name. Sorry, I've got two, doesn't help, name. And then inside of now my function, I can access this the attribute that's been sent across so that I can print it out. So let's give this a go. There we go. So you can see that it's been passed across to this function and I printed out that name. So I can do this multiple times just to showcase this. Let's go for Mike. So now I'm going to print out two names, Xander and Mike, for example. So hopefully I've got this clear. I've suggested to you that this here is the argument. Okay, it's the value that we're sending to the function, and this is the parameter. Okay, so I've suggested this is like a variable name, and what we're doing here is we're assigning this attribute here, or this argument, sorry, to this variable name, which we can describe as like the parameter. So we can have multiple parameters. So let's go for f name and s name, surname and first name. So we can take in multiple parameters here. We just need to use the comma and then go ahead and just add the second argument. So what we're doing now is we're passing two arguments over to this function. And you can see it's expecting these two arguments. That's important. And we're going to print it out. So we're going to print out f name, and then let's go ahead and print out the s name. So we're just passing that into our print there. And you can see we're printing them out, Xander X, Mike Y. So if we did make a mistake, we'll get told. You can see here we've got a type error, missing one required positional argument, s name. So that leads us onto this. That leads us deeper into functions. Now, I will be stopping at some point, and in the Python Beginners Plus course, we'll take this further, this idea further of functions, because there's a lot more to learn about functions. But I wanted to give you a basic scaffold here, so you've got the basic picture overview of utilizing a function. Because for some this can be difficult to understand. Once you start scaling this up, although it's okay here in this small scale potentially, once you start scaling this up and you have to kind of follow the code more closely, that can get a little bit more difficult for new developers of Python, or any programming language. So we can see that we can take in two arguments into our function, and more, of course, because we can just keep extending. Okay, so let's put this into a more real life context, something that is something we've covered before here. So for example, we created a bill calculator, if you remember, and I think we just developed it utilizing one script. Maybe there was an if statement somewhere. So let's think about a bill calculator and breaking that into different functions. So we'll make a main function, which will take in information. But let's think about breaking this up into different functions. So this might not be needed in your application. So we are just trying to utilize functions here to showcase what potentially they can do. But what we need to ask ourselves is, what part of the system might we want to reuse? So maybe there's some calculations that we might want to perform that could be utilized in other parts of the system maybe. So for example, here with a bill calculator, to actually calculate the total, we might want to do that in a separate function. To calculate the tax that we're going to apply to it, we might want to perform that in a separate function. So that is kind of what potentially you want to start thinking about when we're building functions. So let's get the bill total. Let's build a function here for getting the bill total. Okay, so bill total. So this is just going to be a function purely for getting the total. That's going to be what the waiter or waitress is going to type in, and we're then going to perform some sort of action on it. Okay, so enter the total. That's before tax, saying anything else that we want to add on to the bill. Right, so what we're going to do here is just return the bill total. Cool. So anytime we need to type in the bill total, we're just going to call this function called bill total. Someone's going to type in the bill total. Right, and then we're just going to return it to perform some additional action. So let's build a function here called main. Okay, so let's get the total. So total equals, we know we're going to call the function now, total build total. So we don't need to pass anything into this at all. And we're just going to collect the information and we're going to return it. So what we have now is the total that the users typed in into this variable total. So what we can do now is work out maybe the discount. So total minus total divided by 100 times 10. Okay, so we're just going to work out some sort of discount, and then we're going to get the final price. So the final price is going to be the discount. We're going to use 2 decimal points, and then we're just going to print out the final. So what we've done here is we've just worked out any discounts that we want to apply. So here, for example, it looks like we've given them a 10% discount. So we've taken the total and then we've done total divided by 100 times 10. That's going to give us 10% of the total. So we just take that away from the total. So we've now got the total and we reduced it by 10%. That's the discount. And then we've just basically converted it to 2 decimal places. And now what we want to do is just output it, the final bill. So let's give that a go. Enter the total 100. And you can see I've taken 10% off, which is 10. So it leaves us with 90. So hopefully you can start to see how that is going to be useful, or how functions are going to be useful for us, because we are slowly breaking up our program into smaller parts, and that can make our program a lot easier to manage as well. Imagine if you've just got a massive block of text. It's much harder to read than potentially breaking it up into smaller parts. And it might be that we want to add different functionality to these different components. And like I said, ultimately these functions allow us to break our program into smaller chunks so that we can reuse that code in different parts of our application without having to write any additional code. I mean, in addition to that, it's worth noting that, of course, if we make these small blocks, over time, you're going to have all these small blocks of code, which potentially you could then use on other programs too. So let's just go through this example again and just ask ourselves, well, how could we possibly break this down further? So if you think about the action, we're performing this action here of the discount. So maybe what we could do here is we could build a new function called calculate the discount, for example. So that could be a new function that we build. So we're going to need to take in the total. So we're going to need to pass in some data so that we can actually perform something on this, on the total. So let's just go ahead and so we're going to pass in the total. So we're going to be able to perform this action here. So discount equals that, and then we're going to return the discount. Okay, so we're going to perform the calculation and then we're going to discount. Now what we want to do here is, let's just get rid of that there. So we're going to call the main. That's going to, first of all, ask the user to type in the total. Right, so once we've got the total, we then want to print out the total. Okay, so you're probably wondering what's going on here. So at the moment, I'm going to start this program. I'm going to get the total. That's the bill total. The user is going to type in the total. It's going to return the bill total. That's going to be stored here in total, and I'm going to then print out the total. Now at the moment, we're not bringing in this function here, so let's go ahead and do that, but here. So the final total equals, let's use format to calculate the discount. Now we need to pass over to the calculate discount, the bill total. Hopefully this makes sense. So we're going to call this function calculate discount here, and we're going to send it across the bill total. That's what the user's typed in. So whatever the user's typed in, we're going to pass it over to this function here through total. Then we're going to reference it as total, and then we're going to take it and do our normal calculation and then return the amount of discount. So what we're going to do here is the final total So we're going to calculate the discount, bam, and bear with me. Well, let's just do the format. So we're going to format this into 2 decimal places, dot 2f. It's confusing for me. It's going to be confusing for you. Apologies. And we're going to then return the final total. Now, at the moment, you may have seen that this might be incorrect. There seems to be a problem here. Bear with me a second. Got too many. Let's run this. All right, so 190. There we go. Right, so hopefully you can see what's going on here. But let's just go for this. So we run main. Right, so first of all, we run this function, get bill total. First of all, we ask the user to type in something, £100. And then we store in total, final total. We call the calculate the discount. So what we do is we pass in the bill total that the user's typed in, and then we run the discount. So the total minus the total divided by 100 times 10. So we get the 10%, we take it away from the total. So now what we have is the total that the user's typed in minus the discount, and then we pass back that number, which is the final number, into final total. And then what we do is we then return it. So remember, we've called this function from here. So the final total gets returned into total, and then we print out the total. And that's how it works. So let's just try it one more time. So with 50, 45, and there we go. So maybe you're starting to see how important it is to potentially name the function, something useful that would be helpful for you to understand what the function or the action the function is performing. So here, calculate discount, here, get total, build total. That's always potentially going to be something that would be useful for you to start thinking about. So let's put our knowledge into action and try and do some code challenges here. So code challenge number 1. So we're going to convert the following example we previously built so that the radius calculation is performed in a separate function, So here, let's just think about this. So we've got, we need some sort of input. And then what we need to do is take this calculation and calculate. So we need to pass in some data. So we enter the radius. That might be 10, say. We're then going to pass that over using a function over to a function. Maybe we call that, for example, workout area or area calculation. We're then going to pass in our radius from the user into that function and then perform our calculation and then return the output back into the initial function so that we can then print it out. Right, so this is where we're going to start. So let's go ahead and just create a main function that we're going to run. So let's call this main. Right, and now let's go ahead and ask the user. So let's get the radius. So let's just take that out, put it here. So this function is going to ask the user to enter the radius. Bam, right. So now what we want to do, now we've got that, let's now pass it over to a function called calculate area, for example. So we're then going to pass in the radius into that function, and something will get returned from it, the result. So then what we want to do is we want to print it out. So let's print out x. There we go. Right, so now we need to make a new function then called calculate area. We want to pass in the radius. So I'm just going to call this radius as well, or data or rad, whatever you like. And then let's now go ahead and create the area. So radius, so that's going to be now rad. So remember, we're passing in as rad, so we need to reference it as rad. Okay, so we're passing over the radius that the user's typed in over to our calculate the area. Now we're going to utilize that data now to perform our calculation. I'm going to pass it into area. So now what we're going to do is return the answer. So that's area 1. So the answer calculation gets stored in area 1. and now we're going to return it back. So that gets returned back in X, and we print X. Right, let's give this a go. So, oh, that seems to be a problem. Right, okay, so we just need to get rid of that. There we go. So the radius 100. There we go. So let's move through challenge 2. So let me explain. We made an example to calculate, a code example to calculate the total cost of an item once a discount has been applied. So I think we did that in the situation of, for example, a restaurant situation where we had a bill calculator. It calculated the discount. So I have provided a code example for us to start with for this challenge. So head over to the GitHub repository and you'll see that. And we'll start with that in a second. So what I'd like you to do is take that code from the example, and I'd like you to change the amount of discount applied based upon the amount spent. So for example, if the customer spends 100, then the discount should be applied to it of 20%. If the customer spends less than 100, they would receive a 10% discount. So we need to provide or create some sort of way of capturing the user's input. That's the amount the product costs. And then we need to create a function potentially which will reduce or calculate the discount for that item based upon the cost. If it's more than 100, we're going to apply 20%. If it's less than 100, we're going to apply 10% discount. So in addition to that, try and use a try and accept to capture the user's accidentally typing the wrong input. Okay, so for example, here we know that the input should be a float, for example, £100 10 pence or 10.99 or something. So if the user types in a string, then we want to use a try and accept to capture that and close the program. Now here's a tricky thing. I've left you a little bit of research here potentially. So when we run a try accept, what's probably going to happen here is that the program's still going to run afterwards. And so the problem you've got here is that obviously once we have a problem with try accept, the program shouldn't be able to run any further. So the bit of research or the challenge here is how can we close the program at that point? Of course, we'll go through this in the example if you're not too sure. So just try and see how far you get. Pause potentially here, have a go, and then we'll go through the example or the solution. Right, so let's start by having a look at the example. I'll quickly grab that. So that should be in the code repository. So this is what we had originally. We had two functions here, one that calculates the discount, one calculates the bill. So we run main, that will get the bill total function. So we don't pass anything into that. So we ask the user to type in the bill amount or the cost of the item. And then what we do is we get the final total by calculating the discount here. So we call the calculate discount function that performs the action. Now don't forget we pass in the original amount entered by the user into the function here so we can perform the calculations, and then we return the final amount minus the discount in the return. So that gets stored here in final total. That gets passed in the return back to the main, back to this function, and then it gets outputted. So that's what we had originally. So let's have a look now at changing this so that we can add a little bit of work here so that we can calculate different discounts depending on how much they spend. So let's start with main. All right, so let's build a new function called main, and then we're going to use a try accept. So that was the idea. So we're going to try, in this case, the user is going to type in the amount. It's going to be a float. Now, if it isn't a float, we want to use an accept here. It's going to be a value error. So we're going to capture that, and we're going to print incorrect value entered. Right, so if you've been through the series, we've done this a number of times, so you're probably already familiar with that. So this E, if you're wondering. So what we can do is we can take that data and then we can explore it further through this variable, if you like here. So a value error will be performed, and there's lots of data we could capture inside of that to print it out or to utilize in some other way. So as E, so I can capture that information as E. So here, for example, I could print out something if I wanted to. Right, so let's now move on slightly. So we're going to get the final total. So what we're going to need to do here is create a new function called calculate discount. We're going to pass into that the bill total. That's the bill total that the user typed in. This is going to be a function, so we're going to perform that function. It's going to return back some information which is going to be stored in final total, and it's going to be formatted into 2 decimal points. Right, so then we're going to print that out, and that's going to be the final total printed out. Right, so the problem we've got here is if we run this and we do have an error, we're then going to continue running the rest of the program, or trying to run the rest of the program. And that causes a problem, of course, because we don't actually have the correct amount to then send to the function to perform the action. So what we're going to do here is we're going to bring in sys from the main Python library, and that's going to give us a few more tools where we can, for example, close the program. So here I'm going to use sys.exit, right? And you can see what's happening here. It's going to exit the interpreter by raising the system exit status. So essentially it's going to stop the program. Now there's a few different options here. This is just for an example for now. By all means, go and explore the different options, but that's going to, in our case, work okay. And it's going to close the program if there is a value error. And that's what we want to do. Right, so we could turn this into a loop, if you remember. So if they do type in a value error, we could loop them back and ask them to type in a new number. That's something that you could explore and definitely apply to this example. Right, but we've learned something new. Right, so now we need to build the calculate discount. So we do that, a new function called calculate discount. We're going to take in the total. That's the bill total and the users entered. And now what we can do is calculate the discount. So this is going to be a new function that we're going to build that's going to calculate the percentage of the discount. We're going to pass into that the total so we can work out how much discount to apply. Right, so now what we do, we can now take that data that's returned. So we now know how much discount is going to be applied. So we can apply that to our calculation and work out the final amount, which is going to be this function here. And then we can pass that back over here into, remember we're passing it back here into final total, and we're going to print that out. Cool. Right, so now then, let's create a new function that we're calling here called working out or calculate discount percentage. We're going to pass in the total. Don't forget that. So that moves across here. So we now have essentially a variable here that we can access in this function called total. That's going to store whatever the users typed in originally. And now if the total is more or equal to 100, we're going to have a discount of 20%. Else we're going to have a discount of 10%. And now we're just going to pass return discount. So whether it be this or this, we're going to return the discount, whether it be 20 or 10, back to this function here, store it here in discount percentage, so then we can perform the calculation. Cool. So we perform that calculation, we send that back, remember, it goes into final total, and then we print out the final total. So let's just give this a go. Enter the amount, 100. So that should be 20%, remember, equal or more than 100. And there we go. So now we have a discount of 20%, which is 80. And that's the final price. Now, by all means, go ahead and just add some more functionality to this, if you like, as I've already mentioned. Maybe you want to change the printout, but this is quite a complex program for beginners to understand. So don't worry if you're feeling a bit perplexed with this. Just try and follow it through step by step. Maybe just rewind here and go back, and I'll explain it again and again until you kind of get it, what's going on. Maybe you might want to start thinking about maybe just drawing a diagram to help you understand the flow, and that's something that we could definitely cover maybe in Python Beginner Plus to help you understand the flow of what's happening here. And over time this will just make sense, and you'll start to read this in a much clearer way, in a much simplistic way. It just becomes second nature. Okay, so at this point you may still feel as though you need more practice. And the best thing to do now is for you to go through all the other examples that we've done in this course and just apply and adapt it to functions. And just keep going. Now, I've already mentioned that there's a lot more to functions that we haven't mentioned here, and we will cover that in the Python Beginners Plus course. And that's simply because I wanted you to become as familiar as possible and to get as much experience as possible utilizing the skills that we've taught you here before you move on to these other aspects. So, because what we got here is the real fundamentals. And if you don't understand this, now you might understand this straight away, but it can be a little bit difficult once you scale it up. So keep practicing, keep typing out that code and try and adapt it to different situations, passing in data, multiple data, returning data. And once you get to a comfortable point, you can then start thinking about understanding and learning a little bit more about functions. And it is important. Functions are a mainstay of your application. So you probably will be utilizing functions quite a lot. So it's well worth just taking your time here and going through the basics and then slowly, steadily moving into more complex areas of functions. So if you have watched the whole series, thank you very much. I really hope you enjoyed and it has been useful for you or to you. And like I said, we will move this on to Python Beginners Plus, where we explore some of the different areas of Python where you might want to start coding in. Graphical user interfaces, web, for example. There's lots of places where we can apply Python. And in addition to that, we'll go through some more robust examples of functions and learn a little bit more about functions and other aspects that we've already learnt on this course. So I thank you one more time, and I do hope to see you in another tutorial. So thank you very much and good luck.